tasmania.gov.au.
And welcome back. A couple of hours ago I had the opportunity of speaking to Christine Milne, the leader of the Greens. She's had a very, very big day, press club and all. So I think you'll enjoy this interview where we go to all the reasons why Labor and the Greens had their divorce. Here it is. Christine Milne, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Now, you've had a big day today, and I guess the big news is that the deal with the ALP is all off, that you and the government have parted ways. What's been the problem?
Look, the point is I wanted to be very upfront with the Australian people. The government has walked out on the agreement. That's been happening over the last few months, and quite clearly they have no intention of working collaboratively with us on matters in the public interest, doing more on climate change, actually fixing the mining tax. Some of the decisions they've made are shockers, like Tony Burke's decision on Gloucester in New South Wales on coal seam gas, and of course his decision to reject the Heritage Council advice on the Tarkine. It really had got to the point where we were giving them confidence and supply, and they had this cover of an agreement with us, and it was quite clear we needed to be upfront and say the ALP have left the agreement because they'd rather the miners than us.
Well, I'm not sure that I can agree with all of that. I mean, when you look at Tony Burke, he did try pretty hard on the Murray-Darling, didn't he, to come up with something that both sides could live with?
Well, on the Murray-Darling again, there's a massive allocation of groundwater to go to the coal seam gas industry, for example. When you look at what he's agreed to, there just isn't enough water in the river. He didn't put even in what the minimum was that the scientists said was necessary, let alone the gigalitre quantity that they said would be optimal for the river.
But isn't that always the problem here, that the government can't ever do enough to satisfy you and then keep all the other groups that have to be satisfied on board as well? I mean, all those communities down that river, they were agitating so much for so long.
Certainly the communities on the river, but they have different opinions about what they need and what they want, but ultimately none of those communities will be secure unless there's enough water coming down the river. That's the fact of it, and if you over-allocate the river system, the river will die in the long term, and that's been going on for more than 20 years, and that's always the issue. With the Tarkine, for example, Tony Burke rejected actually listing any of it for its natural values because he basically decided he was going to hand it over to the miners. Now, there's no justification for that.
Well, I think, you know, going back, and it is a long time since I was Environment Minister, didn't I fail to protect the Tarkine as well?
Yes, you probably did, but
I think I did. I think I failed there.
Well, the issue here is, at least, Richo, we stopped Wesley Vale. That is something that you can be proud of, and I certainly am.
But also, we put 20% of Tasmania into World Heritage. We did something. I mean, it wasn't as if we didn't do anything, but again, there was always that extra bit. I can remember having the 3-day cabinet debate, no sleep, and barely winning, and feeling so triumphant when I came out, only to have Bob Brown tell me how hopeless it all was. I mean, that is something I can never forget.
Well, let me tell you now, more than 20 years later, those forests on the eastern boundary that you backed us against Michael Field, I have to say, in trying to get into the World Heritage Area, are actually part of the World Heritage nomination that's now gone forward to Paris. So, you know, we will persist, Richo. It might take us 20 years, but we'll get there. And ultimately, I'm hoping that in the middle of this year at the World Heritage Committee meeting, we actually finally get that eastern boundary forest issue sorted out.
Yeah, well, let's hope that we can, because there's going to be so many issues to be sorted out. And the other, I suppose, interesting development as far as the Greens are concerned is there seems to be this movement on both sides of politics to say they won't preference you at the next election.
Well, it's ever been thus. In fact, it's always interesting coming from Tasmania because what happens there usually precedes what happens in the rest of the country. And you'll recall in Tasmania, the Labor Party there tried to do everything to get rid of the Greens out of the Parliament, couldn't succeed, and so they got with the Liberals and changed the electoral system to try to get rid of us, and that didn't work. Ultimately now they just ruined the parliament, and now it's going to have to be increased again. So I've been through that once before, and quite clearly Labor decided to preference the Liberals in Melbourne, in Victoria, to get the result they did at the state election. So we know that's going to be the case, and that's why we're going to do everything in our power to get Adam Bandt elected in his own right, and to make sure we get quotas in the Senate around the country, so that those preference deals that are done actually put to one side, and we're going to ask the people to just ignore the preference deals and vote one for the Greens.
Yeah, but if you track the polls, and I had a look at the last year, I mean, the highest you've been is 14, the lowest 8. Generally speaking, I think you're around what you are now. I think it's 9 in Newspoll and 11 in Nielsen. I mean, those numbers don't indicate that Adam Bandt's going to win on his own.
Well, let's see. I think he can. He's got a fantastic support crew in Melbourne. He's done a huge amount of work. Of course, it's going to be an uphill battle, but let me tell you, we're up for it, because we want to keep Adam in Parliament, because he's done a fantastic job. And actually, it's because we got balance of power in both houses that we were able to force the Gillard government to deliver on carbon pricing and get the 10 billion into renewables, and that's all. The people of Melbourne made history once. I want them to do it again.
Yeah, but see, the very things you mention are the things that have got Labor into so much strife, are they not? I mean, the carbon tax has caused Julia Gillard, basically it's killed her. It's just killed her off. And one of the reasons, and this is what I particularly wanted to ask you about, is this $23 price. I mean, it's down to less than $5 in Europe. How do we justify $23 here?
Well, first of all, in terms of the so-called damage to the Labor government because of carbon pricing, I don't think it's because of carbon pricing. I think it's because there was the pledge before the election not to have carbon pricing, and then the agreement to do it. I think that has been as damaging or more damaging than actually the campaign that Abbott has run. But back to your question about price. Clearly, the issue here is we're trying to make sure that there's no dislocation between now and when we go to a floating price in 2015, and that requires the European price to recover. Last night in the EU was the first of the decisions in the Environment Committee there to actually get rid of some of the excess permits out of the scheme to drive up the price, and I'm really hoping that that translates in about a month's time to a bigger vote. And providing we can get the price restored, we should have a fairly even trajectory.
Yeah, I'm afraid I think that's being very, very optimistic. I just can't see it happening. The second part of that was, of course, renewables. Now, what is happening with renewables? Because the more I read about this, the more it disturbs me. It seems to me that it costs more for the consumers to have things like solar power and wind power. Trying to connect them to the grid actually sends up the price.
Well, one of the big problems, one of the great things that's happened because there are so many renewables in the grid now is that the wholesale price is being driven down, and that flows right through. So that is a really good outcome of having the renewables in the system. But one of the disturbing things, as you rightly say, is that when people are trying to connect to the grid, there is a lot of resistance from the existing operators, and part of that is state governments. So that's where it's about not just increasing the renewable energy target, not just getting the 10 billion in to give leverage for, say, large-scale solar, but we really need massive reform of the electricity market and the rules of the electricity market. We've got that started, but it's nowhere near finished, and we really need to look at those rules to facilitate this transition to 100% renewables. But
it seems to me with all of these things that we're talking about, when you look at your position in the polls, it's fairly static. I mean, you're around 10%. Bob Brown comes and goes, and everyone said that under you that would mean a big collapse. It didn't. The vote has stayed much the same. But it doesn't increase, Christine. So you can't tell me you're winning these arguments, because the mob out there look to me like they're just saying no.
Well, the issue here is, Richo, we've got to look at the future, and I don't think anyone who looks at the science can possibly come away and say that we don't need to drive this massive transition in the Australian economy. And it's always been the people who are driving change the hardest who are resisted by the vested interests that exist. Now, this is a resource-based economy, no wonder. You've got the big miners pushing back against the Greens. The Greens are going to hold firm, as we have done against the logging industry in Tasmania for years, but ultimately it's because we believe in it and keep prosecuting it that we're ultimately going to achieve, whereas the major parties in the middle wobble all over the place and don't have the resolve to drive the change.
But are you sure you're going to get the change? Because what concerns me now, and I wrote a column last week, I'm still a believer in climate change. I'm certainly a believer in an ETS. I'm not sure I believe in the carbon tax the way it's drawn up at the moment, but I'm still a believer in general. And it seems to me that the whole argument that we've had over the last 2 years is one that people like you and I are losing, people like Julia Gillard are losing. Because at the moment, the support for that tax or a regime similar to it has gone from 72 to 30 in 4 years.
That's not surprising when you have a look at how much money has been poured into some of the think tanks on behalf of the fossil fuel industry. The campaign against wind farms is essentially funded by the fossil fuel industry. Look how much the Koch brothers put in the United States. Look at the Heartland Institute. How much money does the IPA get, for example? No one knows where the IPA gets its funding in Australia, but they're running massive denial campaigns. You've got Gina Reinhardt, who puts Ian Plimer on her board.
No, but I appreciate that. But what concerns me is that on these basic issues, when we talk about those renewables and the costs, it just seems to me that we're going to have to rely on coal-fired power for a long time to come if you want ordinary people, poorer people out there in the suburbs or the bush, if you want them to have affordable power to be able to keep the air conditioner on in summer or the heater on in winter. Aren't we going to need coal-fired power for a long time to come?
No, we're not. Interestingly, just on price, solar and wind are now cheaper in Australia, so that is very exciting relative to coal. And in terms of supply, I've just been to see the biggest, one of the biggest solar thermal plants in the world in the south of Spain, and I went to look at it because it's there that they've got molten salt, so they use the heliostats to reflect onto the tower. The heat then melts the salt, and then the heat can be extracted later, so you can get power after dark. So we are now on the verge of a solar thermal revolution, and I think that's really exciting. The question is there the political will to take on the vested interest in coal? And the report
Christine,
today...
unfortunately, I think there's another question, and that is, how long are we going to be on the verge? It seems to me we'll be on the verge of these things for the last couple of decades, and I suspect we will be for some time to come. Look, I'm really sorry, but we're over time, and I'm getting signals from all over the place, so I've got to end it. But it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Lovely to be on the show.